10 creepy unsolved mysteries from London. A lot of dark and mysterious things have happened in the history of England's iconic capital: Jack the Ripper, the London Monster, Dick Van Dyke's Cockney accent. It's a city that's been burned to the ground, blitzed, and then put back up again. The home of red buses and black cabs has a fair amount of intrigue to offer. Here are 10 mysteries from London's past and present that have yet to find answers.
1. The murder of Edmond Godfrey. A justice of the peace named Sir Edmond Barry Godfrey came to a violent end. 3 men were eventually executed for his murder. What makes Godfrey's death somewhat unique is the universal agreement that these men were not responsible for the crime, leading to an unusually large crop of alternative theories naming the real killer or killers. Some even argue there was no murder at all. Godfrey was born in 1621 into a family who was part of the English gentry. Most of his life was unremarkable. He attended Oxford, toured the continent to complete his education, and studied law, although illness forced him to abandon his legal studies before graduation. He took up a career as a merchant instead. It has been speculated that poor health accounted for his odd and rather unlikable personality. Godfrey was considered cold, unsociable. He never married and may have been asexual, and arrogant. In 1660, he became a magistrate, where he gained a reputation for being severe, but also hardworking, brave, and just. In 1666 he received a knighthood for his exemplary public service during the Great Plague of the previous year. He was also rarely for a public official at that time seen as being very lenient towards Catholics. He had many dissenting friends, and it was believed that this usually stern man was willing to bend or overlook laws in order to protect them. Despite his religious tolerance, he also became increasingly opposed to the government of King Charles II and its pro-French policy. According to at least one contemporary report, Godfrey was a member of the Payton Gang, a secret organization dedicated to overthrowing the king and making England a republic. With his ties to the Catholics on the one hand, and his alleged membership in the anti-Catholic, anti-monarchical Payton Gang on the other, Godfrey had his fingers in many contradictory and potentially very dangerous spies. The story of Godfrey's death may be said to have started in 1678, when 2 men, Titus Oates and Israel Tonge, came before him to give depositions describing an alleged popish plot, spearheaded by the king's brother the Duke of York, to kill Charles and conduct a mass slaughter of Protestants. Although the whole affair remains somewhat mysterious, we know that Godfrey was remarkably reluctant to become entangled with a story, particularly when Oates named Edward Coleman, the Duke of York's secretary, as a main actor in the plot. Godfrey and Coleman were close associates. Godfrey knew that if any formal inquiry of Oates' fable was made, his known connection to Coleman would mean that he himself would be implicated in this so-called plot. However, if it could be shown that he had tried to bury the story, that would not only also implicate him, but leave himself open to being charged with misprision of treason. Godfrey dithered about what to do with this testimony, and seemed to want to ignore the whole mess in the hopes that it would just go away. He told a friend that he would get little thanks for his involvement with Oates' tale, and would fain have had it done by others. He became a seriously worried, even frightened man. And he had every reason to be fearful. On October 12, 1678, Godfrey left his home at about 3 p.m. to go for a walk. He never returned. He suddenly and inexplicably vanished. Godfrey's disappearance caused an immediate public uproar, with everyone immediately assuming the missing magistrate had been a victim of foul play. Godfrey's brothers, Michael and Benjamin, went to the Privy Council arguing that their sibling had been murdered by the Papists, a sentiment that was widely held. Godfrey's whereabouts remained a mystery until October 17, when his body was discovered near an area known as Primrose Hill. The corpse was lying in a ditch, run through with his own sword. The body was badly bruised, and marks of strangulation were found around his neck. According to some accounts, his neck had been broken. He had evidently been stabbed only after his death. The inquest into his death became more of a political tribunal than an objective search for the truth. Rumor had it that witnesses were intimidated and evidence suppressed in order to foster the belief that Godfrey had been murdered by the Catholics. Titus Oates' wild stories about treasonous papists and their evil conspiracies appeared to have been confirmed by Godfrey's murder, although it never was plausibly explained why the Catholics would wish to kill someone who had been one of their few prominent friends. It was one of history's many curious ironies that a man who, in life, had strong Catholic sympathies, should have been elevated in death as a Protestant martyr. Parties hostile to the government used highly fictionalized accounts of Godfrey's life and character for propagandistic pamphlets, plays, and poems illustrating the dangers of Catholicism. Even his funeral became an exercise in depicting the dead man as someone who had heroically died for the Protestant cause. Catholics were persecuted, even, like Edward Cullen, executed, in Godfrey's name, something that undoubtedly would have appalled him. Lost in all this, of course, was the issue of who really did kill the magistrate. Any serious investigation into Godfrey's murder was stalled until November, when an informer named William Bedloe went to the authorities claiming that Godfrey had been taken to the Queen's Palace, Somerset House, and murdered there. Bedloe named Miles Prance, a servant of Queen Catherine's, as one of the killers. When Prance was arrested, he saved his own skin by turning King's evidence. He claimed the murderers were three of Somerset House's servants, Robert Green, Henry Berry, and Lawrence Hill. Although there was absolutely no evidence against these men other than Prance's story, the trio were quickly tried and convicted for the killing. With what was seen as a fitting sense of justice, the three condemned men were hanged near Primrose Hill. To most of the public, these executions were seen as confirmation that Godfrey had indeed been murdered as part of a widespread Catholic plot. However, once the general atmosphere of anti-Catholic paranoia and hysteria began to cool, doubts began to arise about the justice of the verdict. Prance's story was easily discredited, and he wound up being convicted of perjury. Green, Berry, and Hill were eventually completely exonerated of the murder, although that was obviously little comfort to them by that point. These second thoughts were first publicized in 1682, when three men named Nathaniel Thompson, William Payne, and John Farwell were put on trial for libel. They had suggested that the magistrate had really killed himself, and the coroner's jury was pressured into bringing a false verdict of murder. By the mid-1680s, England had a new king, a new government, and a consequent willingness to take a second look at Godfrey's puzzling death. The first serious investigation into the mystery was taken by Sir Roger Lestrange. His 1687 book, A Brief History of the Times, argued that Godfrey had killed himself, and that his brothers subsequently covered up the truth about his death in order to save his estate from being forfeited to the Crown. Lestrange's book is not very trustworthy. He was known to have manipulated evidence in order to make it fit his thesis, but it deserves some credit for keeping the case alive, even if his conclusion is not generally accepted today. The next major analysis of the Godfrey mystery came from a legal officer named Roger North. North contended that the magistrate had been murdered, but was uncertain who did the deed, and why. The most he could suggest was that Titus Oates or Oates' political supporters had murdered Godfrey because the magistrate knew Oates was a rank perjurer. Philosopher David Hume offered a more contrarian view of the case. Although he did not offer a possible suspect in the crime, he scoffed at the notion that the Catholics had any motive to kill Godfrey. His analysis of the available evidence led him to propose that the murder was the result of some personal quarrel against the magistrate, and had nothing to do with politics at all. Hume's theory was endorsed in 1924 by J.G. Muddiman, who proposed perhaps the most plausible theory of the murder. He suggested that Godfrey's killer was Philip Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. Pembroke was unquestionably one of the nastier figures of his era. The Earl had only a passing acquaintance with sanity and decent behavior. He was a drunken, sadistic, horrifyingly violent man with a penchant for inflicting physical attacks on his many enemies. He was quite definitely capable of the crime. And he had reason to harbor a grudge against Godfrey. In 1678, the magistrate was the foreman on a jury that convicted Pembroke of murder. Regrettably, the Earl successfully appealed this conviction in the House of Lords, and he was released from custody. After this miscarriage of justice, Godfrey prudently left the country for a short time, but upon his return, Mudman believed the psychopathic aristocrat finally got his revenge against him. Unfortunately, although Pembroke had the classic means, motive, and opportunity for the murder, there is no contemporary direct evidence linking him to the crime. In recent years, historian J.P. Kenyon suggested keeping things simple. Perhaps Godfrey was just a random victim of some anonymous highwayman or footpad. Alas for this prosaic theory, it fails to explain the curious fear and depression Godfrey exhibited before his death. And if he was just another robbery victim, why was jewelry and money left on his body? On the other end of the spectrum, Stephen Knight of the infamous Jack the Ripper Royal Freemason conspiracy fame saw Pembroke as a hitman hired by the Peyton gang to kill Godfrey, thus ensuring that the magistrate would not reveal their secrets. How did Edmond Barry Godfrey die? Was it suicide, a political assassination, a vendetta by groups eager to shut Godfrey's mouth, a revenge killing, an ordinary street crime, a high-level conspiracy? Take your pick.
2. The Cheapside Hoard. In 1912 a group of London workmen were demolishing an old jeweller's house on Cheapside in London, when they literally struck gold. No one knows, however, exactly how many pieces of Tudor and Jacobean jewelry were found, since the workers immediately stuffed their pockets, caps and handkerchiefs and went to a character out of Dickens, Stony Jack, who ran a pawn shop and was known to pay cash for any interesting finds, no questions asked. Some of these he sold on to the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert and the Nassau Museum of London, which received the mother lode. All these institutions started a very unseemly squabble to lay their hands on the entire treasure. Accordingly it was only shown to the public for a short while just before WW1, when it went into a bank vault, where it has basically been lying around until a brand new exhibition opened this week. The Cheapside Hoard, London's Lost Jewels showcases the very best of the Museum of London, says Sharon Edmond, director of the Museum of London, and continues, "Our vision is to create a revitalized, world-class museum through state-of-the-art galleries, and exhibitions jam-packed with groundbreaking research in historical objects. The Museum of London tells the story of the world's greatest city and its people. And, as London's most exciting stash of buried treasure, the Cheapside Hoard tells a thrilling tale of mystery and discovery, with every jewel and gemstone unlocking a story. For the first time since 1912 the scattered pieces have been reunited. The new exhibition shows almost 500 pieces of unique jewelry, rings, brooches, pendants, chains and bracelets. Many of these are suspended in dark cases with a glittering light intended to emulate the candlelight, in which many would have been seen. Also exhibited are portraits and other objects from the collections meant to provide context for the jewels. But what is the story behind the hoard? How come it was hidden and later forgotten for 300 years? The curator Hazel Forsyth has worked to unravel this part of the story and published it in a catalogue accompanying the exhibition. She can tell an even more lurid story of murder, skullduggery, fraud and foul play. It appears that part of the collection might have come to England in 1637, when a Dutch jeweller, Gerard Pullman, went on the Discovery, a ship, which sailed from India back to England. With him he brought a large sea chest and several smaller boxes filled with a king's ransom, diamonds, emeralds, sapphires and other gems later valued at £150,000. Inside a fortnight he had been poisoned by the ship's surgeon, stripped and heaved overboard, while officers and crew had helped themselves to his massive fortune. By the time the chests were officially opened in London they were found to be half empty. Later some of these gems were offered up to London jewelers and, it is believed, were partly acquired by a new gang of criminals, the Simpsons. One of these, Thomas Simpson, had a lucrative side business, flogging counterfeits, and it is exactly this knowledge, which has led Hazel Forsyth to conclude that the Cheapside Hoard might have been connected to this family. In the collection is found 2 counterfeit Pallas rubies cut from rock crystal, polished and dyed to represent the real thing. Yet Thomas Simpson wasn't the only Cheapside jeweler who engaged in foul play, and he was only one of 18 jewelers who leased a property at 30-32 Cheapside, where the hoard lay buried underground for nearly 300 years. Who the owner was, thus remains an enigma. Part of crucial clue to why it was buried, has however, recently been uncovered, stemming from a previously overlooked intaglio, a gemstone with an engraved design, blazoned with the heraldic badge of William Howard, the first and only Viscount Stafford, 1612 to 1680. He left England in 1641 during the Civil War, and it is believed that the stash was buried during the following decade, when its owner must have died without having occasion to divulge the hiding place. The 16th and 17th century jewelry trade was clandestine by its very nature, and skullduggery was rife, tells Hazel Forsyth, exhibition curator, and continues, jewelers couldn't shout about what they were up to or the precious gemstones that they were dealing with. That in itself would make them walking targets for theft, corruption, or worse. Yet thank goodness that some of those jewelers and their underhand dealings were caught out and made to feel the long arm of the law. The level of detail found in contemporary court documents, witness statements and other archive material has proved a veritable treasure trove to delve into. It has brought about many juicy findings that we would not have known about had the trade been transparent and squeaky clean. The Cheapside Hoard is a priceless collection of jewels and the City of London's most exquisite stash of buried treasure. And it is the single most important source of our knowledge on early modern jewelry worldwide. The exhibition is sponsored by Fabergé, Gemfields and Coutts and supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
3. The St. Pancras Walrus. Archaeologists have been left stumped after the remains of a Pacific walrus were found buried, among human skeletons in a churchyard near London's St. Pancras train station. The 9 bones of the 4-metre-long animal were found inside a coffin with 8 other sets of human remains, including 3 skulls, dating back to around 1822. Researchers from Rambo Cultural Heritage and Archaeology initially made the discovery in 2003, but following detailed studies of the bones, as well as searching through zoological records, the team has not found any conclusive proof as to how the animal arrived in the UK. They believe all the bones inside the mysterious coffin may have been used for medical science by one of the 40 anatomy schools in London opened during the 19th century. The burial ground was discovered during excavations of the station when the Eurostar terminal moved from Waterloo to St. Pancras in 2003. The research team was led by archaeologist Phil Emery and was funded by High Speed. The walrus bones, as well as the human remains discovered in the coffin, all showed signs of being cut up and dissected for medical research. Many of the remains showed cuts and scrapes consistent with dissection, which was legalized by the Anatomy Act of 1832, and at least one of the human skulls discovered showed signs of cranial autopsy, drilling into the brain. Emery, along with Alan Pipe from the Museum of London Archaeology, studied the bones and looked at London Zoological Society records for any clues as to how the bones arrived on the site. In their book, St. Pancras Burial Ground, Excavations for St. Pancras International, the London terminus of High Speed 1, 2002-3, Emery and Pipe said, the animal bone consisted of a small, moderately preserved group of 8 bones derived from a walrus of a very large size and robust build. The sample includes bones from a lower forelimb, a forefoot, first and second metacarpal, the lower hind limbs, fibula, calcaneum, astragalus and first cuneiform. These bones are significantly larger than their reference equivalents held at the Narwhal History Museum. Microscopic examination revealed that all the St. Pancras walrus bones show some degree of surface erosion and butchery marks. 3 clear superficial transverse knife cuts were noted. Mr. Emery told Mail Online, the way that the walrus bones were found among the skeletal remains suggests they would have been used as a teaching collection from a research institution. Historical accounts of animal dissections show that in 1853, Professor Owen from the London Zoological Society carried out medical research on a walrus. This could have been the walrus found buried in St. Pancras, yet Mr. Emery and his team have not been able to categorically confirm this to be the case. He believes the coffin with the walrus bones dates between 1822 and 1854 because it was found in a horizontal burial trench. Up until November 1822, Burials were carried out on a plot-by-plot basis before the trench method was introduced. Mr. Emery added that this was also the year when the old St. Pancras Church lost its status and the new St. Pancras Church was used in its place. This would have created an upheaval of bones and burials. Walruses are hunted and killed for their skin and ivory tusks, and the animal found beneath St. Pancras Station may have also been brought to the UK for trade. The remains of the St. Pancras Walrus are on display at the London Archaeological Archive and Research Centre in Hackney, East London. All the human remains have been reburied. Father James Ilston is currently seeking funding for repairs to the St. Pancras Old Church on the site of the dig.
4. Who owns Wattenhurst Mansion? Protruding into the clouds above the leafy skyline northeast of Hampstead Heath is a crane so tall it is visible for miles around. In fact, the only Londoners in N6 who struggle to make out the top of it are those living right beneath it in the equally verdant environs of Highgate Village. But what they can't see is more than made up for by what they can hear, the constant growl of the giant diggers cutting a small canyon into what has become known locally as Ground Zero, and the screeching roar of articulated lorries, an estimated 4 an hour for 6 months, queuing up to remove the fresh earth. If that weren't enough, there is the metal hoarding around part of the 6-acre site, cabins emblazoned with the logo of the contractor responsible for excavating 15,000 square meters, not to mention the numerous builders, landscape gardeners, decorators, project managers, architects and engineers who will be coming and going, all in the name of making Wattenhurst House, London's largest private house, if you discount Buckingham Palace, even larger and grander. In fact, when work is completed, sometime in late autumn 2012, Wattenhurst House will be more than double its original size, extended by 45,000 square feet, the equivalent of 10 very generously sized detached family homes. It will be a mere 2,000 odd square feet smaller than Buckingham Palace, which many don't count as a private house anyway on the basis that it belongs to the taxpayer. But although Wattenhurst was bought over 3 years ago and work has been going on for 18 months, no one knows exactly who the new owners are. The house was bought in 2008 for £50 million by the offshore company Saffron Holdings. It was then rumored that the real buyers of the house near the summit of Highgate West Hill, which enjoyed a brief turn in the limelight as the famed Academy House in 2002, were construction tycoon Elena Bacharina and her husband, Yuri Luzhkov, the former mayor of Moscow. The couple have repeatedly denied all such reports and have taken legal action against those who have suggested otherwise. No other names have ever emerged, but the very rich are often extremely secretive. It is understood that even Robert Adam, the architect behind the £50 million expansion project, does not know who his client is. He receives his instructions via an intricate web of companies and agents that appear dedicated to keeping the secret, well, secret. But there is no mystery when it comes to what is being proposed, thanks to the UK's often infuriating but essentially open and democratic planning system. Documents from Camden Council's website show precise details of what is being built. It can be seen that the main house, which is listed Grade 2, will be largely unaltered save for the demolition of an unexciting 20th century wing, which stands at 90 degrees to the house and which will be replaced by a traditional, if supersized, orangery. But the real story will unfold underground, where the biggest double basement in London is being excavated. The main attraction of the subterranean section will be a 70 feet, double-height swimming pool, leading onto a fully equipped spa with sauna, steam rooms and changing cubicles. Next to them will be a room containing 4 massage beds and a hairdressing salon. On one side of the pool will be a large and well-equipped gym, exercise room, and on the other a double-height spa bar. Further along, there is a double-height 33-seat cinema and its projection room. The rest of the upper basement level will contain guest and staff accommodation, beneath which will be 24 car parking spaces, complete with a car lift to ground level. Completion of the works is planned for October 2012, and the program also includes large-scale landscaping. Also incorporated into the design is a borehole system, which will circulate water through a network of pipes running deep, below ground to absorb the Earth's warmth and bring it back to the house. Using special compressors, the heat can then be used for radiators and underfloor heating, but also to drive air conditioning and refrigeration systems. When done, it is hoped that Wettenhurst can once more live up to its illustrious past. Standing in 6 acres of woodland, the position has always commanded some of the best views in London. The house itself started life in 1774 as a relatively modest if exquisite Georgian house called Parkfield. At the end of the 19th century it was acquired by stockbroker Walter Scrimgeour for his wife and 8 children, for whom he added a schoolroom, nurseries, a gym and a billiards room. One of Scrimgeour's daughters, Phyllis, was to marry Sir Louis Greek, King George VI's close friend, mentor and tennis partner and the grandfather of the editor of the Evening Standard. She and her sister Beryl were later to recall what fun they had there. "We did gymnastics in our long skirts, trapeze, parallel bars, that sort of thing. We were rather good at it." When the family left Parkfield in 1913, it was bought by Liberal MP and soap magnate Sir Arthur Crossfield, a wealthy playboy who was an MP for a few years and was then made a baronet. He married Domini, the fiery daughter of a Greek merchant who was once the ladies' tennis champion of Switzerland. The couple spent £1 million, more than £20 million in today's money, replacing Parkfield with a 40,000 square feet Queen Anne-style palace in which to entertain London society. Sir Arthur added 4 tennis courts, 2 hard, 2 grass, which were to become the main attraction. As grand houses need grand names, Sir Arthur chose Wettenhurst, a combination of the old Anglo-Saxon words witten, meaning a parliament, and hurst, a wooded hill. And he used it as a means to climb London's social ladder. Every year, after the Wimbledon Championships, the international tennis stars and society figures would head for a series of charity tennis parties on the Wettenhurst courts, which soon became an established part of the season. The future George V played there, watched over by his wife. Other players included Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, Princess Juliana of Holland and Princess Ingrid of Sweden. Music was also important. Sir Yehudi Menuhin became such a great family friend that he lived in a wing at Wettenhurst for a while. The Crossfields were also active philanthropists and campaigners, and it was Sir Arthur who led the fight to save nearby Kenwood House's 130 acres of North London woodland from the bulldozers and turn it into a public park. However, in the mid-1930s Sir Arthur lost a fortune in a failed Greek mining venture and was then killed falling off a Continental sleeper car. At Wettenhurst, Lady Crossfield's tennis parties continued, even during the Second World War, when they were used to raise funds for bombed-out families. The house became an RAF entertainment center, and, after the war, royalty and celebrities flocked back. The present Queen is unenthusiastic about tennis, but, as Princess Elizabeth in 1951, she became one of Lady Crossfield's greatest social triumphs. Meanwhile, Lady Crossfield was fast running out of money and gradually the tennis parties fizzled out. After her death in 1963, the house passed to her adopted son, Paul. By 1970, however, the thrice-married heir could no longer afford to keep Wettenhurst. He sold it for £1.3 million. The new owners, a property company, cared little for history and drew up plans for a big housing development, which was defeated by a concerted action mounted by prominent Highgate residents. This was to set the pattern for the next 3 decades, with the house passing from one developer and mystery foreign owner to the next, in a stream of failed planning applications. Then, in 2002, Wettenhurst shot to national fame, followed by infamy, when it became home to the BBC's Fame Academy. 9 portable buildings, a TV studio and generators were placed in front of the house along with an external scaffold fire escape and internal multi-gym and hot tub, all without listed building consent. Then came the noisy, smelly generators, helicopters flying overhead and amplified music being played late at night, not to mention the contestants singing. Within 2 years, the BBC itself was evicted from the Fame Academy after local residents complained about the show's constant noise and disruption. Producer Endemol was refused permission to locate the program at Wettenhurst on a longer-term basis, while Camden Council planners accused it of causing irreversible damage to the listed landmark. The council made it clear it wanted the building to be bought by someone who would restore it to its original glory. But nothing happened until the heady days of July 2007, when local developer Marcus Cooper bought Wattenhurst for £32 million, saying he would spend millions restoring it and resell it for £150 million. Within weeks it was back on the market, untouched, at £75 million. The current owners and their ambitious plans have not had an easier ride. Their planning application was rejected by Camden Council and finally won on appeal to a government inspector. Wattenhurst now rings to the sound of building work both above and below ground. As for the mystery owners, the long-suffering neighbors, and the rest of us, we'll have to contain our curiosity until they actually move in. If they ever do.
5. The abduction of Elizabeth Canning. It is still one of the great legal controversies of the 18th century. On January 1, 1753, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth Canning disappeared from a country lane in what is now the heart of London. Canning, who worked as a maid in London, had been spending New Year's Day with her aunt and uncle in Whitechapel, and was walking back to London 200px Elizabeth Canning when she disappeared. After she failed to arrive in London, Canning's employer, John Wintlebury, contacted her mother, who then raised the alarm. A volunteer search consisting of friends, family members, and Wintlebury began investigating the disappearance. Since there was no organised police force in London at the time, it was up to the volunteers to knock on doors, distribute advertisements and flyers, and offer a reward for any information leading to her safe return. While someone nearby had reported hearing a scream at the time of her disappearance, the search would peter out after several weeks. On January 29, however, Elizabeth Canning reappeared at her mother's house in obvious distress. The normally neatly dressed Canning appeared so bedraggled, that her mother fainted on recognizing her daughter and seeing her condition. Along with bruises on her face and body and a bad cut near one ear, Canning was also half-starved and wearing only a petticoat and a bedgown. Neighbors and family members came to the house and immediately began questioning Elizabeth Canning about what happened. They eventually managed to piece together a coherent story from Canning, who was obviously traumatized by her experience. According to her, she had been walking along the country lane when she was attacked by two thugs near Bedlam Hospital. They robbed her of her money along with the nice dress she had been wearing. After striking her on the head, the thugs dragged her to a nearby large house while she was in a semi-conscious state. At the house, she was turned over to a group of women who then tried to force her into prostitution and locked her in a hayloft when she refused. She was left there for weeks with nothing but a loaf of bread, a pitcher of water, and the mince pie that she had been carrying. Canning eventually managed to escape but injured her ear in the process. Though unable to identify the house in question, people hearing her story immediately suspected one particular house in the area that already had a sinister reputation. Not only was it filled with gypsies, derelicts and sneak thieves, but there were several loose women living there suspected of running a brothel. While Canning was far from certain based on the description of the house she was given, she eventually concluded that it was the right house. After being given some time to recover, Elizabeth Canning was questioned by an alderman, who had doubts about her story but agreed to issue a warrant. Again, due to the lack of a formal police force, the search was carried out by volunteers. To lend a semi-official status to the search, the Lord Mayor, Sir Crisp Gascoigne, supervised the search. Despite her frail condition, Elizabeth Canning was taken to the house as well to identify her abductors. All of the residents of that house were arrested and arraigned a few days later. The Justice of the Peace in question, who happened to be the famous author Henry Fielding, signed the arrest warrants. The mistress of the house, Susanna Wells, who preferred to be known as Mother Wells, and a second woman, Mary Squires, were accused by Canning of stealing her corsets. Wells was also accused of keeping a disorderly house, another name for brothel. Since Squires was widely suspected of being a gypsy, though her exact ethnic origin was never clear, Canning's accusation was considered proof enough and she was later went on trial for theft. Squires' son, John, was also suspected of being one of the men who had abducted Canning in the first place, though he managed to avoid arrest. Despite the international publicity the case generated, Sir Crisp Gascoigne decided to investigate further. Elizabeth Canning's description of the house had more than a few discrepancies, especially the room where she had supposedly been held. Mary Squires, for her part, produced witnesses who testified that she was in another town at the time of Canning's alleged abduction. She also had a remarkable appearance, including an extremely large nose and an inflated lower lip, which Elizabeth Canning never mentioned. Despite these discrepancies, Elizabeth Canning refused to recant her statement. This sparked a controversy that polarized English society. On one side were the Cannonites, Elizabeth's supporters, and on the other side were the Egyptians, based on the then popular notion that gypsies came from Egypt. Pubs across the country became embroiled in fights over the case, and large sums of money were raised on both sides, whether to defend or convict Mary Squires. It also became a celebrated cause in literary circles, with Henry Fielding, Tobias Smollett and Voltaire each weighing in on the case. Things became so heated that the Lord Mayor himself was dragged from his coach and physically assaulted by a mob of Canning's supporters. After going on trial, Susanna Wells was publicly branded with a letter T on her thumb, T standing for theft, and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Mary Squires was sentenced to be hanged. Afterward, Elizabeth Canning was praised as a public hero, and she was given a tidy sum of money courtesy of her supporters. Dissatisfied with the verdict, Sir Crisp Gascoigne reopened the investigation. After questioning one house resident whose testimony had been the most damaging against Mary Squires, Gascoigne managed to break down her story. He also questioned the witnesses who had provided the alibi for Squires. Based on this investigation and his doubts about Elizabeth Canning's story, he ordered her arrest for perjury and recommended that Mary Squires be released. Based on the reasonable doubt over the case, King George II granted a stay of execution for Mary Squires, and eventually a full pardon. All of this outraged the Cannonites, and some of them threw stones at the king's coach. It hardly ended there though. John Miles, the leader of the Cannonites, arranged to have the men who had provided Mary Squires with an alibi charged with perjury. They were quickly found not guilty and released. To avoid arrest, Elizabeth Canning dropped out of sight and only turned herself in after a new Lord Mayor was installed. Her trial began in April 1754, and went on for 7 days, with newspapers running pro and con editorials of the case. After a narrow vote, she was convicted of perjury, willful and corrupt, and sentenced to 1 month in prison, to be followed by her transportation to America for 7 years. Canning's defenders insisted that she had been telling the truth, though her accusers suggested she had made the whole story up. The verdict also thoroughly ruined Crisp Gascoigne's political career, since much of the outrage was linked to his investigation. Still, being sent to America was not that much of a hardship for Canning, since her supporters raised enough money to make her voyage comfortable. They also supplied her with money for a new start. After arriving in Connecticut, she became part of the household of Reverend Elisha Williams. Technically an indentured servant, she was treated more like a member of the family. After Williams' death in 1755, Canning married John Treat, a grandson of a former governor of Connecticut. They would have 4 children together before her death in 1773. She is buried somewhere in Wethersfield, Connecticut, though the exact location of her grave has been lost to history. Did Elizabeth Canning commit perjury? The case demonstrates many of the problems investigators face today when dealing with traumatized witnesses. Some later commentators on the case have suggested that Canning may have experienced a form of post-traumatic amnesia, with many details she recalled afterward being implanted in her mind by overeager supporters. Modern investigators are specifically trained to avoid leading questions to avoid contaminating victim recall, which may have happened in Elizabeth Canning's case. Whatever the actual facts of her disappearance, Elizabeth Canning's case demonstrates the power that the media had, long before the invention of the Internet. Political careers were made and broken by newspaper editorials over the case. No real solution for what really happened in 1753 has ever been put forward, and John Paget's described the case as, in truth, perhaps, the most complete and most inexplicable judicial puzzle on record. And it still is today.
6. The Natural History Museum Mystery Bug. As collections manager at London's Natural History Museum, Max Barkley has traveled the world in search of rare and previously undiscovered insects. So when his 5-year-old son took a break from a picnic lunch last year, in the museum's garden and returned with an insect in hand, Barkley could not have guessed that his question, "Daddy, what's this?" would lead to a global detective hunt that has so far stumped Barkley and the world's other entomologists. Despite working with an insect collection of over 28 million specimens, Barkley and his colleagues at the Natural History Museum have been unable to identify the almond-shaped insect, about the size of a grain of rice, that has in the past year made itself at home in the sycamores trees, on the 19th century museum's grounds in central London. My field work has taken me all over the world, to Thailand, Bolivia, and Peru. So I was surprised to be confronted by an unidentifiable species, while having a sandwich in the museum's garden, Barkley says. Several months of research led Barkley to discover that the insect, which resembles the common North American box elder bug, is actually most closely related to Turricatus roeslii. But that European bug is also associated with alder trees rather than sycamores. An insect specimen found in Nice on France's Mediterranean coast, which is now in the collection of the National Museum of Natural History in Prague, turned out to be identical to the mystery London bug. But that specimen, it turned out, had been misidentified as Turricatus roeslii. There are two possible explanations, says Barkley. One is that the bug is roeslii and by switching to feed on the sycamores, it has suddenly become more abundant, successful and invasive. The other possibility is that the insect in our grounds may not be roeslii at all. In recent years, several new insects, spiders and beetles have been discovered in Britain, a trend many attribute to the ability of these species to survive winters warmed by climate change. In 2005, Edinburgh Zoo issued a public notice after several panicked Scots reported a non-venomous spider called a false black widow that had a disconcerting behavior of rushing towards people who approached it. The spider turned out to be quite common, in the Canary Islands. Barkley is not convinced that climate change is responsible for these new inhabitants. It's very difficult to judge because the period of time we have seen global warming potentially influencing the insect fauna is almost exactly the same period of time since the European Union opened up its trade barriers between member states. So in the last decade and a half we've been importing a lot more from Italy and Spain, and southern France, and we've had this climatic change, so we have two potential causes. Whatever the reason for the appearance of the mysterious new bug in London, Barkley says its rampant spread around the city is harmless. However, it does show what's possible, if more damaging species invade. The struggle to identify the critter displays not only the mystery of nature, but also the fickleness of the science of taxonomy. Identifying insect species can be extremely difficult. Some scientists estimate we have managed to identify only 10% of the insect world so far. The rest, like Barkley's almond-shaped mystery bug, are perfectly happy to crawl along without any christening or approval from their relatively gargantuan cohabitants. But that won't stop scientists like Barkley from trying. For him, the question asked by his 5-year-old son last March is a calling he still feels compelled to answer.
7. The Beast of Sydenham. It has probably slunk off to a neighboring suburb to become the bench panther, the Catford cheetah or the Beast of Beckenham by now. But residents of the blossom-filled streets of Sydenham were still shaking last night as a father of 3 told how he had been mauled by a black cat the size of a Labrador. Police armed with taser-stun guns sealed off roads in southeast London, school gates were locked and teachers warned pupils to keep away from wooded areas, after Tony Holder escaped with a cuffer around the face from the big cat. Mr. Holder, 36, was calling in his tabby, Kit Kat, at 2:15 am yesterday when he spotted his pet being savaged by a 5-feet-long animal. The black, panther-like creature then sprang at him in his back garden. It had pinned the cat down, but when it saw me it let the cat go and jumped on my chest, knocking me to the ground, he said. I could see these huge teeth and the whites of its eyes just inches from my face. It was snarling and growling, and I really believed it was trying to do some serious damage. I tried to get it off, but I couldn't move it. It was heavier than me. I was scared. I really thought my life was in danger, but all I was worried about was my family. It was an absolute nightmare. In the gloom, Mr. Holder's 11-year-old daughter Ashley watched from a bedroom window. "I just saw my dad flying backwards and struggling with something," she said. "I was really scared." As Mr. Holder was being treated for scratches by ambulance staff, he saw the beast saunter past again. Armed police arrived, sealed off the streets around Mr. Holder's home, loaded their stun guns with tranquilizers and searched for it with flashlights. The animal gave them the slip, but as tabloid reporters scoured the streets in safari gear brandishing butterfly nets, the Guardian picked up the scent of something big across the railway line by cattling close. Billy Rich, 44, was looking out of his window at 5:30 am, when he saw a black creature leap across the road and bound south towards Mawa Park. "I see a thing," he said. "What's he supposed to have seen?" asked his ex-wife. "The Beast of Sydenham," your correspondent explained. "The only Beast of Sydenham is him," she replied, prodding a finger at Mr. Rich. "On the news they said it was as big as a Doberman, but it wasn't," insisted Mr. Rich. "It was big and black, and I thought, fucking hell, what was that? It definitely wasn't a pussycat. It was too big. The way it jumped, you could tell it wasn't a dog. It definitely wasn't a fox, but it can't be a panther. Where would a panther come from in Sydenham? The British Big Cat Society estimates there could be 100 big cats roaming the land. A £5,000 reward has been offered for the Beast of Burford, a large black cat spotted near the Oxfordshire town." Scotland Yard confirmed the Beast of Sydenham was the second serious sighting of a large black cat in southeast London in the past 3 years. Officers responded to reports of a large black cat in Exleyaswood in Shooters Hill, South London, in 2002 but failed to trace the animal. Danny Bamping, the founder of the society, warned that if the cat was a melanistic leopard or a black panther, it could kill. "They can be very, very dangerous," he said. "There have been incidents in North America where joggers have been killed by these creatures." A Scotland Yard spokesman confirmed that officers had visited schools to warn them about the big cat. A police officer who attended the incident said he thought he saw what looked like a black Labrador, the spokesman said. One pupil at Sydenham High School for Girls said the gates had been locked at lunchtime and students had been told to stay away from wooded areas and dark alleyways. She said they had also been instructed to make a loud noise wherever they went to scare off the beast. Parents said they would be keeping their children indoors. "The garden is secure, but I wouldn't let my little boy Morgan go out and play today," said Kelly Wood. "He's 19 months. I think he's quite an edible size." Other people were skeptical. "I saw a little moggy lying in the path, but that's about it," said Kim Kimberley. "I can't see it, unless he's the one from Bodmin Moor and he jumped on the train and came up here."
8. The origin of the London Stone. The London Stone is a historic artifact that can be found on London's Cannon Street. This mysterious relic is basically a block of limestone. This type of limestone does not occur naturally in or around London, and that the nearest place where it can be naturally found is in Kent. Therefore, the London Stone was likely to have been brought to London from somewhere outside the area. Nobody knows for sure, however, as to where the stone actually came from. Equally puzzling is the original purpose. Regarding this matter, much speculation has been made. A bronze plaque on the sloping top of the casing in front of the stone, dating from 1962, reads, "London Stone." This is a fragment of the original piece of limestone, once securely fixed in the ground now fronting Cannon Street Station. Removed in 1742 to the north side of the street, in 1798 it was built into the south wall of the Church of Street Swithin London Stone, which stood here until demolished in 1962. Its origin and purpose are unknown, but in 1188 there was a reference to Henry, son of Ilwyn de Lundenstein, subsequently Lord Mayor of London, but there must be more than can be said about this artifact. Roman or before? There are a few things that can be said with certainty regarding the London Stone. For example, The London stone is of a type of stone known as oolitic limestone. This type of stone was often brought to London during the Roman period for building and sculptural purposes. Still, the Romans were not the only ones who used this stone, as it was also utilized in the city during the Saxon and medieval periods as well. The location of the London stone has led to one speculation, that it was once part of a monument erected in the forecourt of a palace. The London stone is found towards the southern end of the medieval Candlewick Street, which is known today as Cannon Street, and opposite St. Swithin's Church. This would place it in front of the Roman building commonly identified as the Provincial Governor's Palace. Thus, the London stone may have been part of a monument that once stood in the forecourt of this palace. However, there are those who have suggested that the London stone predates the arrival of the Romans. One of the most well-known of these speculations was made by the 18th, 19th century English poet and painter, William Blake. According to Blake, the London stone was used as an altar by the ancient Druids to sacrifice their victims. A similar assumption can be found in an updated version of John Stowe's 1598 The Survey of London. The historian John Strype, who updated this piece of work during the 18th century, entertained the possibility that the London stone was used during ancient pagan worship. The London stone is sometimes called the Brutus stone, and is said to be a link between Britain and Troy. According to one legend, London was founded by a man by the name of Brutus of Troy, a descendant of the hero Aeneas. This legend is said to have its origins in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century History of the Kings of Britain. The connection between the London stone and Brutus, however, can only be traced back to the 19th century for certain. In 1862, an ancient saying appeared in an article in the periodical Notes and Queries. This saying claimed that so long as the stone of Brutus is safe, so long will London flourish. The article further claimed that the stone was brought from Troy, and was originally erected as an altar in the Temple of Diana. It seems that, apart from the author of the said article, no one else knew about this legend. A King Arthur connection? Without any definite answer as to the original function of the London stone, it is likely that this issue will continue to be speculated on. One of the seemingly newer legends surrounding the London stone is that this was the stone from which King Arthur pulled out Excalibur, assuming that Excalibur and the sword in this stone are one and the same. Another modern legend asserts that John Dee, an advisor of Queen Elizabeth I, believed that the London stone had magical powers. A forgotten artifact. If the London stone was indeed an important object, it does not seem so today. About 10 years ago, it was displayed in a curbside cage that was stuck on the wall of a Sportex sports shop, 111 Cannon Street, London, EC4N5AR. Surrounded by modern sports equipment, the London stone must have presented a strange sight to visitors. The sports shop was later replaced by a W.H. Smith, though the stone was left in place. It has been reported that permission for the demolition of this building has been granted, and a special raised plinth so that the artifact can be viewed by the public will be included when the new premises are built. In the meantime, the stone will be displayed in the Museum of London during the construction period.
9. The hanging of Roberto Calvi. 1 month before the 30th anniversary of one of London's most enduring murder mysteries, the Mafia godfather at the heart of the case has spoken for the first time about why he believes the real killers of Italian financier Roberto Calvi will never be brought to justice. Calvi, dubbed God's banker because of his work with the Vatican, was found hanging from scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London on June 18, 1982. Bricks had been stuffed in his pockets and he had more than £10,000 in cash on him. In the months before his death he had been accused of stealing millions being laundered on behalf of the Mafia. His death was originally ruled a suicide but later judged to be murder. In July 1991, Francesco Franchi the Strangler Di Carlo, a Mafia godfather who had lived in England since the late 1970s, was named as Calvi's killer by a supergrass. Di Carlo has since become a supergrass himself. Speaking from the small town in central Italy where he now lives, Di Carlo related how he first came to hear that he had been accused of Calvi's murder. "I was in university, that's what I called the prisons in England. We were all in the association room watching television when the news came on, that the killer of Calvi was Francesco De Carlo. All the prisoners and guards looked over and stared. I just shrugged my shoulders and said that they must be talking about someone else with the same name as me. De Carlo seemed a likely suspect. He had arrived in the UK in the 1970s, relocating shortly after being linked to the murders of 2 Sicilian police officers. He bought businesses and a palatial home but soon came under the watchful eye of British customs, who believed he had moved in order to oversee the Cosa Nostra's operations in the UK. Between 1980 and 1985, customs officers allegedly linked him to at least a dozen multi-million-pound drug hauls, only a handful of which were intercepted. In 1985, Palermo's flying squad attempted to extradite De Carlo to Italy in connection with an earlier case. Within weeks of the request, the deputy head of the squad and a commissioner in charge of tracking down fugitives had both been shot dead. De Carlo was eventually linked to an attempt to smuggle £60 million worth of heroin to Canada through London and was found guilty at a 5-month trial at the Old Bailey, although he claims to have been the victim of a conspiracy. The police officers escorting him to court each morning told how, as they were led from the cells, De Carlo's co-defendants would bow and kiss his hand as they passed him, standard protocol for greeting a senior Godfather figure. Although De Carlo denies killing Calvi, he admits that he and his mafia colleagues wanted him dead and that his boss had attempted to contact him to carry out the hit. I was in Rome and received a phone call from a friend in Sicily telling me that a certain high-ranking mafia member had just been killed. I will never forget the date because of this. It was June 16, 1982, 2 days before Calvi was murdered. The friend told me that Pippo Callo, known as the mafia's cashier, was trying to get hold of me because he needed me to do something for him. In the hierarchy of Cosa Nostra, he was a general, I was a colonel, so he was a little higher up, my superior. While I finally spoke to Pippo, he told me not to worry, that the problem had been taken care of. That's a code we use in the Cosa Nostra. We never talk about killing someone. We say they have been taken care of. Calvi was naming names. No one had any trust in him anymore. He owed a lot of money. His friends had all distanced themselves. Everyone wanted to get rid of him. He had been arrested and he had started to talk. Then he had tried to kill himself by cutting his wrists. He was released, but knew he could be rearrested at any time. He was weak, he was a broken man. I was not the one who hanged Calvi. One day I may write the full story, but the real killers will never be brought to justice because they are being protected by the Italian state, by members of the P2 Masonic Lodge. They have massive power. They are made up of a mixture of politicians, bank presidents, and the military, top security and so on. This is a case that they continue to open and close again and again, but it will never be resolved. The higher you go, the less evidence you will find. De Carlo became disillusioned with the direction the organization was taking, deciding to become a supergrass. My grandfather was the first to be in the Cosa Nostra and the rest of my family followed. Back then the system was different. We were a guarantee for people who had no justice, we were there for the defense of the weak. We were not against the state, we were a state within the state. We had solicitors, doctors, ministers. We would get the politicians elected and we would command them. And we made a comfortable living. There were rules. You could not kill women or children or innocents. You could not kill journalists because they were just doing their job. If you wanted to kill someone, there had to be a reason. They had to be harming the organization. You could kill a policeman because he was lying about you, but not for doing his job. You kill one, another comes along, so what have you achieved? Nothing. But then things started to change. Drug trafficking came in and made people very rich. People had too much money and power. The scruples were lost. Magistrates were being bombed along with women and children. It wasn't Cosa Nostra anymore, it was Cosa Monster. I didn't want to be a part of that, so I decided to turn. My life now is very different, very quiet, but I am happy.
10. The Pimlico poisoning. It might be a combination of attractive residential streets and interesting metropolitan life today, but in 1886, Pimlico was the backdrop for a sensational murder mystery that's still unsolved today. 30-year-old Adelaide Bartlett stood trial at the Old Bailey for the murder of her husband, assisted by her clergyman lover. Edwin Bartlett, the owner of a chain of grocery stores, had been found dead by his wife after a short illness, during which she had said to their Isaacan, "If Mr. Bartlett does not get better soon, his friends and relations will accuse me of poisoning him." Prophetic words indeed. Edwin and Adelaide's marriage had been a strange one. She was, probably, the illegitimate daughter of a French count, and was 11 years younger than her husband. On their marriage, he sent the Anglo-French beauty to boarding school for 2 years, to remedy the gaps in her education caused by her French upbringing. When she finally moved in with her husband, his father accused her of having an affair with her brother-in-law, an accusation Edwin forced him to retract before a solicitor. In 1885, the Bartletts met George Dyson, a young Methodist minister. Edwin appears to have encouraged a close friendship between Adelaide and George, even going too far as to stipulate that if he died, he expected them to marry. In August, the Bartletts moved to Cleverton Street, Pimlico, and Edwin bought George a railway season ticket so that he could visit to continue Adelaide's school lessons in Latin and maths. Their landlord's maid later testified that she several times come upon George and Adelaide in positions unusual for tutor and pupil, once discovering them on the floor together. And then Edwin became ill. He had a long-standing dental problem, wherein an expert dentist had sheared decayed teeth off at the gum line. He had also convinced himself he had syphilis, though he didn't, and was taking the poison mercury to treat the disease. And he seems to have suffered from depression, which kept him an invalid despite medical attention. It was at this point that Adelaide made her unfortunate observation about accusations of poisoning. At the end of December 1885, Adelaide asked George Dyson to buy her some chloroform. She told him it was to treat Edwin, and also mentioned to their landlady that she regularly gave her husband chloroform sleeping drops. George told the two chemists from whom he purchased the chloroform that it was for use as a stain remover. On New Year's Day 1886, Adelaide woke their landlord saying, "Come down, I think Mr. Bartlett is dead." The landlord, a Mr. Doggett, was suspicious. He refused to register the death until a post-mortem had been conducted. The PM found no natural cause of death, but did discover chloroform in Edwin's stomach, which, it concluded, had killed him. Adelaide was arrested, and so was George, accused of being an accessory before the fact. Adelaide's trial was sensational. The prosecution immediately dropped all charges against George Dyson, asking the jury to find him not guilty. He was then called as a witness for the prosecution, but ended up more help to the defense. He testified that Edwin Bartlett believed himself to be terminally ill, and that Adelaide had not asked him to conceal the purchase of the chloroform, which made the defense's case for Edwin having administered the chloroform himself so much the stronger. Medical experts then testified as to the difficulties of using liquid chloroform for murder. There was no evidence of chloroform in Edwin's windpipe, as there should have been if it had been administered by someone else. Adelaide was found not guilty, but only just. On delivering the verdict, the foreman said, "Although we think grave suspicion is attached to the prisoner, we do not think there is sufficient evidence to show how or by whom the chloroform was administered." Theories abounded. The Bartletts' own physician later wrote in The Lancet that Edwin had taken the poison maliciously to distress his wife with his symptoms. Presumably, he had taken more than he'd intended, and died by accident. Or perhaps Edwin had mistaken the bottle for another medicine, and drunk it before he could realize his mistake. Or perhaps Adelaide really had murdered him, believing maybe that she would then be free to marry George Dyson. This is borne out by brandy found in his bedroom, which she said had been used to try to revive him, but could have been used to disguise the taste of the chloroform. Sir James Paget of Bart's Hospital said, after the acquittal, that Adelaide should tell us in the interests of science how she did it. But she never did, and the truth about what really happened in that Pimlico boarding house will now never be known.